An individual's survival depends upon how effectively your body, your system is coordinating with the changes in the environment. For that, you need to have a proper understanding of your nervous system. So let's go to the introduction to the nervous system. Now, here, these are the objectives we are going to discuss under as an introduction to the nervous system. We would be discussing what are the components of the nervous system, what is the structure and the classification of the neurons, what are the basic properties of nerves, what is special about a neuronal communication, what is a nervous impulse transmission, and we'll also be talking about the reflex. So this is the objective of today's class. And now we look at the nervous system. We have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. And what does it do? Integrative, and it's a integrative, and the control center of the nervous system is the central nervous system. Now, coming to the peripheral nervous system, the nerves outside the central nervous system belongs to the peripheral nervous system, and these are the nerves which connects the central nervous system to the muscles and the different organs in your body. Now, here you have the picture. The yellow color fiber is the central nervous system, and what you see, the blue color fibers like the telephone wires is actually the peripheral nervous system. And it is the peripheral nervous system which is connecting the central nervous system to different parts of your body and to different organ systems in your body. Now, let's look at the components of the central nervous system. Now, central nervous system, brain controls everything that is happening in your body, and it's a seat of emotions, thoughts and movements, and your brain is totally encased in the skull. So you have the picture of the brain there, and now going to the components of the central nervous system, brain, then we speak about the spinal cord. Spinal cord is basically like an extension cord that runs down the whole back of the person. Now the nerves travel through the spinal cord and it is protected by the backbone. So in picture what you see is actually the backbone, and inside it you have the second important component of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. Now coming to the components of the peripheral nervous system, you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves and 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Now coming to nerves, what are these nerves? All of us know nerves, neurons, but how exactly do you define it? Nerves are actually bundles of axons which are located outside the central nervous system. Central nervous system comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. Now it's composed of, you already know nerves, you have got both the motor nerves and the sensory nerves. And what do, the nerves? They send messages all over the body, and the messages move through the body faster than the blinking of the eyes. That is actually the speed of conduction of impulse through a nerve. Now, coming to the organization of the nervous system, there are two types of cells which you see in the nervous system. You have the neurons and also the neuroglia. What are the neuroglia? Neuroglias are the supporting cells. So neurons, you know, there is a basic structural and the functional unit of a nervous system, and this neurons, they cannot divide by mitosis, and it produce and conduct electrochemical impulses, and it releases chemical regulators. By the release of chemical regulators and by produce and conduct electrochemical impulses, we are actually making a reference about how the generator potential is created, which is actually built up in an action potential, which is causing the release of a neurotransmitter. That's how the conduction of impulse is happening through a nerve. And then we have the supporting cells of the neuroglia. Now, the CNS, the supporting cells are different. The peripheral nervous system, the supporting cells are different. The supporting cells in the central nervous system are astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and the ependymal cells. We'll be discussing all the supporting cells in detail. The peripheral nervous system, you have the supporting cells are the Schwann cells and the stellate cells. Now, coming to the peripheral nervous system, three kinds of neurons, connect the central nervous system to the body. You have the sensory or the efferent fibers, the motor or the efferent fibers, and then you have the association fibers or the interneurons. Now, the sensory fibers or the efferent fibers, they're around 10 million in number, and the sensory receptors will pick it up to the central nervous system. It's a motor or the efferent ones, they're around 0.5 million cells, and it connects the CNS to the muscles and the organ. And then you have the interneurons, whose number are around 20 billion, and its connections within the central nervous system. When we discuss the ascending tracts, we would have discussed, or the descending tracts, how in between the interneurons were connecting it, and it serves an integrative function and the distribution of the sensory information and for the coordination of motor activity is what the functional role of the interneurons is. So that's a part of the peripheral nervous system. And now let's go to the neuronal structure. I think I would explain with this figure. So here you have the structure of a neuron. This is a cell body. You have the dendrites at the center. The soma is there. The dendrites is there. And then you have this one single long process which is arising from this raised part of the axon or the soma. You call it as the axon hillock. And you have the single long process extending, called as the axon, and at the end you can see that the axon is branching to form little enlarged part which you call as the terminal buttons. And can you see these blue color covering? That is actually the myelin sheath which is deposited by the Schwann cells. This actually makes, and between myelin sheaths you can see gaps of axons can be seen. So this actually assures, makes the conduction in a myelinated neuron much faster. This is actually the node of Ranvier, the gaps in between the myelin sheath, what you see. So that's about the structure of a neuron. Now coming to the nervous tissue, cell bodies in the central nervous system, we call it as a nuclei. Now, the cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, we call it as the ganglia, and the nerve fibers in the central nervous system we call as tracts, and the nerve fibers in the peripheral nervous system we call it as the nerves. So I want you all to exactly remember these four: what a nuclei is, what a ganglia is, what tracts are, what nerves are. They're not just like that randomly used. Exactly, there is a point when they are specifically being used. Now coming to the connective tissue coverings, you have the endoneurium, perineurium, and the epineurium. Can you see this? Let's go back to the previous slide. So you have endoneurium here. Now what is this endoneurium? This endoneurium is a covering around an individual neuron, and the perineurium is around a fasciculi of neuron, a group of neuron. Each neuron has got a covering of endoneurium, and the fasciculi of neuron has a covering of perineurium, and around an entire nerve the covering we call as the epineurium. So that's about the connective tissue figuring. Here you can see the epineurium. Can you see the whole nerve? So each nerve has got a covering, each fasciculi has got a covering, and whole nerve has got a covering. So that is what we discuss now. Now coming to the classification of neurons based on their structure. You have the unipolar neuron, bipolar neuron, and the multipolar neuron. This is a figure what I'm going to discuss: unipolar, bipolar, and the multipolar. Now unipolar neuron, which is a sensory neuron, the multipolar neuron is a motor neuron, and the bipolar neuron is an interneuron. Here in unipolar neuron, you can see that a single process which arises from the soma, it divides into two processes. You have the central process and the, I think I'll just take back to the previous slide, and then you can actually come back to this. So unipolar neuron, there are two processes are fused together. That was how it was beginning, and only a single process arises from the cell body. Now bipolar neuron, there are two processes arising, one from each end of the cell body, and multipolar neuron, there is one long process arising from the cell body and the axon, that is the axon, and many small processes make up the dendrite zone. So now you look at the picture, you get a clarity. Unipolar neuron, one single process arises. Bipolar, there are two processes arising, and multipolar, you will have small branches which you call as the dendrites, and the one single process which you call as the axon. Now coming to the supporting cells of CNS and the peripheral nervous system we discussed earlier, let's see them with a closer look with a figure. You have the astrocytes, which are of two types. You have the protoplasmic astrocytes, which actually maintains the blood. The functional importance of protoplasmic astrocytes, you need to know, they maintain the blood-brain barrier, and also it maintains the interstitial environment. So you can see the astrocytes here. Can you see them there? So you have the protoplasmic astrocytes and also the fibrous astrocytes. Now the fibrous astrocytes, what is their function? They form supportive framework for the central nervous system, and it forms scar tissue when the neurons are damaged. When we talk about the Wallerian degeneration and the regeneration, we make a reference about the fibrous astrocytes. Now coming to neuroglia, you have the oligodendrocytes. So I'll just take you back to the previous slide. So we started off with neuroglia. Neuroglia are the supporting cells. We did the astrocytes. Astrocytes, they were of two types, the protoplasmic astrocytes and the fibrous astrocytes. Functionally, they were different. And then you had the second neuroglia, which was the oligodendrocytes. Now, what does this oligodendrocytes do? They actually form the myelin sheath, and the myelinated neurons forms the white matter, and the unmyelinated neurons forms the gray matter. So you have the picture here. Now coming to the third one, the third neuroglia, the microglia, that is the smallest neuroglia, and it is capable of migrating through the neural tissue. Through the neural tissue, it can actually move. And what does it do by moving, or why is it moving? It is engulfing the cellular debris, waste products, and also the pathogens. Now coming to the fourth neuroglial cells, you have the ependymal cells. And where is this ependymal cell seen? It lines the central canal and also the different ventricles of the brain. And what does it do? It participates in the secretion of the cerebrospinal fluid. So ependymal cells, you can see it around the central canal, and it is contributing to the secretion of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now let's come to the electrical property of nerves. Now coming to the electrical properties, we have discussed about the resting membrane potential, action potential. Let me just brief it up for you. Resting membrane potential is the potential in a cell when the cell is at rest. So that's what the definition tells. And the communication by the neurons is based on the changes in the membrane potential. How effectively this resting membrane potential is going to be changed. Now there are two membrane potentials. We have the graded potential and also these are the two ones, the graded potentials, and you have the action potential. Now the graded potentials, they are very small and they are variable changes in membrane potential, and it cannot be propagated for long. These graded potentials can add together and it can create an action potential, and this action potential obeys all or none law. Now what is all or none law? The response the nerve is going to give is not dependent upon the strength of the stimulus, is what the all or none law states. Now a neural impulse, a brief electrical charge that travels down an axon, it's generated by the movement of positively charged atoms in and out of the channels in the axon membrane. So basically, these 3 points is actually giving us a brief explanation on what an action potential is. So we know that the action potential obeys all or none law. So here you have it. A nerve fiber responds to the maximum by giving rise to an action potential. Otherwise, it will not respond at all. So that is what the all or none law states. So you can have it on the x-axis, you have the time. On the y-axis, you have the voltage. And you can see this is a resting membrane potential. This line, a stimulus is given. And when the stimulus is given, you can see that the membrane potential is increasing. There is an influx of sodium ions into the cell. And you can see that the membrane is getting depolarized and it overshoots. You have the spike potential. And at this particular potential, the sodium channel are closed and there is the opening of the potassium channels, causes a massive potassium entry, which makes the membrane to repolarized. And you can see this is hyperpolarization because of the delay. The potassium channels are fast to open and slow to close. So here you have the different phases of the action potential. Now coming to another property obeyed by action potential, you have the absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. Absolute refractory period, the time when a nerve is unresponsive to any stimuli. So when a nerve is in its absolute refractory period, you give a stimulus of any strength, increase the strength and give also, the nerve is not going to respond. Now what is this relative refractory period? The time when a stimuli might induce another. So relative, when the nerve is in its relative refractory period, you give a stimulus of a higher strength, you would get a response. But however, the absolute refractory period, the nerve is going to be totally unresponsive to a second stimulus. Now coming to the conduction of action potential, depolarization in one area would cause the depolarization along the adjacent regions. I'll just explain it with a figure here. See, here you have it. So you can see that the electrical stimulus is given here. Moment the electrical stimulus is given, you can see that where the stimulus is given, the sodium channels are open, the voltage gated sodium channels, and the sodium ions are making into the nerve, and it is actually this particular point A of the membrane is getting depolarized. And now you look at, it's only at this point of stimulus the sodium channels are open. Both on the other side the channels are not open. So point B, point C, everywhere it is not depolarized. Now the next second what happens is this stimulus, the impulse has gone now to another area where here all the membrane is getting depolarized. The potassium ions are going out. There is potassium efflux which is causing the membrane to depolarize. Now the adjacent membrane is becoming depolarized, where the membrane which already got depolarized is getting repolarized. So now here point B, now in this point you can see that the next point C is getting depolarized, where the earlier depolarized part is in its state of repolarization. And if you come back to point A, you can see that that part of the membrane is under total resting membrane potential. So now about saltatory conduction. Saltatory conduction, what happens is, here you have the myelin sheath covering, and this is the node of Ranvier, and it is only at the node of Ranvier that this ionic channels are there. So when a stimulus is given, at this point you have the opening of sodium channels, membrane getting depolarized, and what happens is action potential, there are no ionic channels here in between the myelin sheath. So impulse would actually jump from one node of Ranvier to the other node of Ranvier, and it will cause depolarization of point B. Now point B has got depolarized, then this impulse would jump to point 3 and depolarize point C. When point C is getting depolarized, point B is getting repolarized by potassium efflux. So that is about the saltatory conduction which is happening in the nerves. Now, coming to the communication in the nervous system, adult human brain contains approximately 100 billion neurons, and each makes 1,000 to 10,000 connections with other neurons. That means synapses. We are talking about synapses here. Now, what are the types of synapses you have? You have the axodendritic synapse in the nervous system. You also have the axosomatic synapse. So this itself tell you. Now, this axodendritic synapse is the commonest form of synapse in the central nervous system, where the axon of one neuron is making a synapse with the dendrite of another neuron. Axosomatic synapse is also one of the commonest form of synapse in the central nervous system, where the axon of one neuron is forming a synapse with the soma of the other neuron. Then you have the axonic synapse. Here what is happening is the axon of one neuron is making a synapse with the axon of another neuron. Dendrodendritic synapse, where two dendrites are making a synapse. And this axonic synapse, you see it in the postsynaptic neurons, and the dendrodendritic synapse, you see it in the postsynaptic neurons. Now coming to the synapse, we continue with the types of synapse depending upon the type of impulse or type of energy they respond to. You have the chemical synapse, the electrical synapse, and also the conjoined synapse. Now, what is this chemical synapse? The chemical synapse, the transmission is by the release of neurotransmitters, and electrical synapse, the transmission is through the gap junctions where the electrical energy is being transferred from one neuron to the other. And conjoined synapse, it is partially electrical and partially chemical. Now, according to the number of neurons which is involved to make a synapse, we again divide them into the 1 to 1. That is, one neuron is synapsing with another neuron. Example is where you see neuromuscular junction. Then you have a multiple neurons which are terminating on a single neuron, that is many to one. And then you have one to many, where one neuron is contacting many other neurons. Now, coming to the stimulus. Now, the nervous system also allows you to respond to a stimulus, isn't it? Now, what is basically a stimulus? A stimulus is basically any change in your external environment. For example, a hot stove or tripping over a rock, anything, any stimulus, your central nervous system, you would immediately respond to. You touch a hot object, you withdraw back your hand. You trip and try to fall, you immediately try to balance your body and try to stand erect. So all these are stimulus with which your body is capable of responding to. Now, your reactions to these stimuli are so involuntary and automatic. And automatic means that you really do not have to think about, you automatically would react, isn't it? When you trip over something and you try to fall, there isn't, any need for you to convince yourself that, okay, I need to do this. No. Moment you try to fall, you immediately, involuntarily, automatically, you try to balance yourself. If a bug flies, this is a very good example. If a bug flies to your eye, you will immediately blink, isn't it? There is no need for someone else to tell you that, okay, the bug is now, coming towards your eyes, please blink. That's not required. That's what we tell. These reactions to these stimulus are automatic. Now, what is a reflex? An automatic reaction that happens without thinking about it, and a reflex happens in less than a second. Now, this is an example of a reflex. So, you have your finger in contact with a hot object. So, what you can see is the efferent nerve is taking it to the spinal cord. It is entering the spinal cord via the dorsal root of the spinal cord. And there you can see it is getting connected. It is transferring its information to an internuncial neuron. And from there you can see at the anterior horn, you can see the efferent neuron arising, and it's being connected to the effector organ muscle, and you immediately withdraw your hand. That is exactly what a reflex is. Now, knee jerk is also an example of a monosynaptic stretch reflex, where you strike the tendon of the quadriceps muscle and there is extension of the limb or the leg. Now, going to the summary of the whole thing, what you have done: brain, which is a control center, and you have the spinal cord. The nerves are the ones which carry messages, and there are two types of cells in the central nervous system: the neurons and the neuroglia. And the cell body basically is the life support center for the axon, and the dendrites basically receive messages from different neurons. An axon is that single long process which comes down, and you have the terminal button which is actually getting connected to another neuron through a synapse. Now, neurons were classified. We discussed about the properties of neurons: resting membrane potential, action potential, all or none law, conductivity, refractory period, absolute, relative, synapses, the properties, the types of synapses, the mechanism of action which was happening in synapse, and we even discussed about the reflex. We discussed about a monosynaptic stretch reflex and also the knee jerk with a beautiful figure. So that actually gives you an introduction, a deep look into the different aspects of the components maintaining the central nervous system.